the state, we ought to spread the narrative, and we ought to dissuade educational companies or institutions from accepting such things. We don't propose any sort of policy or any tangible mechanism in which to prevent or ban them from doing so. We are merely suggesting there ought to be a value judgment, and we'll dissuade them from doing it, right? So what do you want to talk about in my speech? I'm going to talk about three main things. First, I'm going to talk about the role of corporations and the roles of corporations with regards to society. Second, I want to talk about the integrity of educational institutions. And lastly, I'm going to talk about why these two cannot simultaneously exist. First, our policy is simple. We think that any university or academic institution or think tanks shouldn't accept these sort of things, right? What we need to understand first about corporations is that corporations are exceptionally profit-driven, right? We think that when such companies are profit-driven, they essentially try to push through their agenda through a neutral arbitrator. No, thank you. So we think that what happens is ultimately they are allowed to spread their insidious agenda through educational institutions that appear to be or are supposed to fulfill the role of a neutral arbitrator or a neutral entity, right? No, thank you. We think that this is often done to promote an agenda to skew and to impact public perception so that they will pander to those corporate logics, and we think that that's ultimately bad, right? We think that ultimately we need to understand that the right for corporations to spread any sort of message, narrative, or expressions is not an absolute right. Because we need to recognize that discourse isn't good all of the time, and we don't think that discourse is going to be beneficial or there's a right to discourse so freely and it's good in every overriding circumstances. We think that there's a bar to which you are allowed to express your things, and we think that the extent and we think the bar is simple. We think that We think that the bar is when you cause extreme negative externalities onto people and ultimately don't fulfill your role in society. Why do we say that? We think that often, We think often the ability and the legitimacy of discourse is ultimately contingent on the ability to withstand contrary positions. And we think that shutting out and muting out dissents or allowing for lobbies to own a certain kind of narrative over everybody else is ultimately unfair. Because what you need to recognize is, fine, we accept that individuals can also fund these researchers, this research and campaign, but the thing is, comparatively, they are never going to be able to outspend corporations simply because the corporations have a track record, have more financial clout, have often in most countries have political capital and those sort of things. So oftentimes we think that even if you want individuals to fund these sort of things, it might work, but very minuscule, and it often drowns out, and it often gets drowned out by the heavy voices of this corporate logic. No, thank you. So what are we going to bring to you so far? What we say is that ultimately the discourse and your right to express these sort of things can be curtailed. Everything we often do it all of the time, right? Next, we think corporations being extremely self-centered often comes at the expense of the interest of an individual. Because what we think happens under status quo is that you get these corporations who go out and say global warming has no harm, and they do these sort of things. Often so that they can use that as an excuse, or a simple excuse in which I'll take you in a moment. A simple excuse for them to continue their selfish acts, such as to procure more oil from other places. We think that's ultimately detrimental. But before I move on, yes.
Would you also not allow Tesla to fund research into green technology?
We ultimately don't. We think that's entirely disanalogous, right? Because we think that what happens under our model is we are stopping companies from using education institutes to research. We think if they want to do it through their own private means, we think that's okay. We think they have their own private sections to conduct these things. Because ultimately you are not using a tool or using an education institution for you to promote such things. So we think it's fine. It's fine if you do it in your own private capacity or through private sectors. It's not fine if you try and spread your discourse through education institutions. We don't think that's fair. What else do we want to talk about? We want to talk about the integrity of academic institutions, because we think academic institutions often holds a very special part in society. Insofar as not only are they impartial, but we think that often people will use educational or academic institutes as a primary means and a countervailing narrative, and to form a contrary opinion to what's often being said and portrayed. So I think it's particularly important in the sense of getting other viewpoints. No, thank you. In terms of getting other viewpoints than what's mainstreamly portrayed. I think it's particularly important. But we don't think this is a novel act, right? Oftentimes we give academic institutions special leeways or grants in the same way that we give professors tenure, in the same way we give lecturers and all sorts of people tenure, because we recognize that we need their work and the works that they publish to remain as impartial and to remain fair and to remain truthful, and like the veracity of the information ought to still remain as being particularly important. We think when you combine these two together, you need to realize that like states often have the right to intervene because we need to protect other people from this sort of discourse, right? Because we think ultimately this discourse is not just words, but often can translate into actions that are largely detrimental. Leading on to my earlier example, right? We think ultimately like spreading things like global warming isn't a problem, or like tobacco is actually good for our health. It's often very detrimental. No, thank you. It's often extremely detrimental because then it translates to bad lifestyle habit, which is actually a tangible harm to individuals. I think individuals often get adversely affected, and we don't think that's ultimately a good thing. We think that we've seen like in a lot of cases, like news corporations and media outlets often try to fact check against information before they release information because often they control discourse due to public knowledge and public perception. But what we need to fundamentally understand is that often the very people who lobby for tobacco and those tobacco lobbies are also the kind of people who fund researchers and say that it's good for our health. Everything is ultimately detrimental. And these are the exact same people who perpetrate news because they're the same people who run and lobby for Fox News. So we ultimately think that they monopolize discourse in a way that hurts individual from having a proper lifestyle, or merely hurts individual in the sense of being cognizant to the fact that there are these harms that are perpetrated onto society. So at the end of this debate, at the end of my speech, what have I shown you? I've shown you three important things, right? I've shown you one, why the role of a corporation can be sometimes circumvented for the greater good of society. Second, I showed you that there's a specific purpose to academic institutions, and the reason why they contribute significantly to society cannot be fulfilled under their model because often academic institutions are no longer being seen as impartial actors under their side. But ultimately, we don't want the same people we don't want the same powerful elites to control political discourse in every field, and because this can translate into real tangible harms for people. No matter what happens in this debate, I'm proud to be in this room. Thank you.